All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kwame Owino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs as the Chief Executive Officer, and I'm glad and welcome you all to this meeting today. We apologize for starting 15 minutes later than we intended, but we'd had a problem here trying to connect to the facility, and then we got that, so we had to shift back everybody again from Google Meet to Outlook. But we thank you for all being here, and we hope others will join us because we had quite some confirmation. Now, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank. We are based in Nairobi, in Kenya, and our work is to carry out research on topical issues affecting Kenya's economy, the region, and globally, anything of significance to Kenyans, especially one that affects Kenya's growth, especially in the medium term. And so bring that to public education platform, convene conversations around those questions, but more importantly as well, try and provide feasible policy alternatives, all focused on trying to push Kenya's growth as a public good in itself. Now, if you're any keen observer of policy discourses globally, you will all, you're probably aware that in the middle of March and most of April, different newspapers and different economics analytical outlets captured a report that was prepared by two authors from the World Bank, of course, working with their own internal teams on industrial policy. We provided a link to that here so that whoever would like to take a look at it, I think it's a report that's worth reviewing carefully if you're interested in economic growth in general, but also if you're just interested in what just the leading ideas of the time about what the prospects, or how economies should be organized, is something that puzzles you. Now, I just looked at it this morning, and that report has been downloaded 25,000 times, which is more than the median number of reports from the World Bank that get downloaded, but that's a different question. So it's also first a reflection of the fact that this is a report that has currency. That's one, based on the number of downloads. Now, whether people read all those downloads is a different matter altogether, but on the whole, that's a reflection of some kind of demand. So that's the first. But the second is that there's been wide coverage of that report. I remember the first time I saw somebody who covered it, quite apart from the fact that we'd had a couple of meetings, was somebody who sent me a newspaper article somewhere, not very well written, to be honest, that said that the World Bank has changed its mind on industrial policy. And this guy then went about to give you a polemic that means a structural adjustments, which was a fad of the World Bank. That's his framing are dead. So we've captured and tried to read these documents. We've captured and tried to find out what the ideas are, and a lot of conversations have been had, in my view, both sharing the report in good light, some in indifferent, and of course some also in bad light. But on the whole, I think the primary idea that we've had out there for many people who have had, some read a few snippets or read the report itself, is that the World Bank has made an about turn on the question of industrial policy. Now, in basic terms, industrial policy is any policy choice a government makes. Of course, there's a solid definition in the book itself. But to speak about it, as I understand in the IEA, my reading is industrial policy is any decision that government makes, right, that favors one industry or tries to raise the prospects of one industry. And there's a whole range of policy tools that governments use historically, but even in the modern times about that. And so what this report was doing was actually to give a fair shake to industrial policy by going back there and saying, okay, fine. How many cases of industrial policy, or rather, how do we classify industrial policy choices? And then to try and look very carefully and keenly about that. And I think it's fairly well done because the report out here has reproducibility tables, which tells you what data was used out here. The one area that has been, I won't use the word controversial, but has gained currency is everybody seems to think that the World Bank reversed itself, that's first. And also that means that industrial policy, regardless of how people define it, works and is a policy choice that everybody should take. I'm not too sure that's the fairest understanding of what these, about 200 and a bit pages, 248, I think, pages reflects. But regardless of that, everybody seems to come that. One of the, and I've had an occasion at a growth summit in Morocco in towards the end of April, towards the end of sometime in April, met one of the authors of the report. And it was very circumspect, but also very fair about saying that, look, we'd like as much as possible for people to read it for themselves and see and to hear what it is, how they interpret the findings, and what part of that people agree with, and any others that they don't. Now, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we taking that opportunity, we've taken a little bit of our time to ensure that we've gone fairly through the report. It's fairly dense, well written for policy language. And I think it's one thing that you can spend reading chapter by chapter to get quite a good view about the history of industrial policy, the World Bank's own position on it. And I think that critical place where people say that, look, the World Bank has eaten apple pie. I don't think that's how the authors really frame it. But regardless of that, we are thinking that it's an opportunity for us here to see what it is we get from that report. And so I and my colleague, Leo Kemboi, will give our own take, basically up here, looking at what the chapters say and interpreting it for ourselves and highlighting some things that are familiar for us, some things that we were surprised to find, quite insightful the report is. And then finally ask ourselves, what does this mean for Kenya? And hopefully, if we can activate our networks with the World Bank, have one or the authors or somebody from there, have in a separate conversation, have a discussion with us about what the findings are and all that. But I think the fairest review of this report that we found was one that's been done by the Economist. Let me just write it out here, dated April 23rd. So it's basically just a couple of days ago, April 23rd, 2026. And the title is, Has the World Bank Performed it? Read it for yourselves, but if you find it, it will be useful as part of the supplementary information that will be useful for you. So my colleague Leo Kemboi will have about 25 minutes to go through the findings of that report. And then after that, we'll speak. He insists, so he's giving me an opportunity to talk about what my thinking about what the report means for a country such as Kenya. Because what that report says, if I may spoil the party, is that industrial policy choices and policy tools are diverse. In many cases, their successes are context specific, and they've been a tool that's available to government. And governments cannot resist, that is my own view, interfering or trying to make economies better by trying to solve, whether they call it asymmetry of information, some things that bring industrial policy to the fore or a rationale for industrial policy. Because of that government propensity to have industrial policy and to behave in ways that affect market outcomes or favor one industry or the other, it is important for government to then carefully consider what tools that they use. So that's what this report seems to say, but people have followed, I think, picking their favorite parts and picking snippets and here and there. But regardless of that, we are hoping that we can give it a fair shake as well, which is important for a report like this. I think it'll be good for development students over time. It was debated in the Growth Summit where I was one way here and one way there. But my colleague Leo will be providing us with at least a background, provide some of the cases that have been presented, which are fairly elaborate, and then obviously ask ourselves, what does it mean? And where does it place industrial policy on the development toolkit of governments? So Leo, you have 25 minutes, then I'll try and wrap up with about a couple of my own points and then open up to the audience for a conversation. Now, while the conversation is going on, we'll keep all our microphones muted and obviously our cameras as well blocked. And Leo will go over 25 minutes, and after that, I'll open up for a Q&A. But in the meantime, because we have up there a chat box, if you have any questions that you'd like to preface or any insights that arise as the presentation is going in, please share them with us up here. So Leo, you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And as Kwame has alluded, this report is very important because it has gained fast global traction. It's very rare that World Bank policy research actually gets to that level. This is one of those reports that we call the stars. It's the star because it has gained global traction, but secondly, it has many people attribute policy change to hit, and attributing that certain changes are going to come from that. So this is the cover page of the report. It's written by Ana Margarita Fernandez and Tristan Reed. Tristan, we've met Tristan, and so the second question is that so we've taken the report. As Kwame has explained, the report is fairly detailed. It's 276 pages. What we've done is to read the report and then look at some of the key things to highlight for our audience. And then secondly, now, as the Institute of Economic Affairs, you all know that we have to have a view of some of the questions on any policy question. So we don't necessarily tend to just discuss, but we have to have a view. And then we'll take now the entire report and put it together in and bring about some principles. What would that mean for Kenya's industrialization path? So we've organized the report into 5 key areas, key issues from the report. What is some of the new things that they've said about industrialization, industrial policy, the 15 policy tools, which is a key feature of the report, and then what the report gets right, what the report doesn't get right, and then Kwame will come and discuss the lessons, what that means for Kenya. The first key thing that the report does is that they define what industrial policy is. And this is important because industrial policy in larger parts of the world has been taken to be interchangeably as policy for manufacturing. And the report takes cognizance and tries to define what in this industrial policy. And they give 3 large things. One, that the industrial policy is government action to increase strategic business activity. And by business activities, essentially, business activity can mean anything from performing tasks to producing products, to a lot of things, whether it's AI in forestry, conducting research in export horticulture. Those are some of the examples they gave. Creating jobs in the film industry. So it's not necessarily industrial policies, government action in strategic business activity. It's not necessarily manufacturing. The second thing is the definition of strategic, which is strategic is what essentially government has decided that is important. So they've made a decision that certain sectors or certain business activities are more important than others. And they make that distinction, the authors make that distinction by actually showing that industrial policy does not refer to manufacturing. It's any business activity that can be strategic, whether in agriculture, mining, services, or any other sector. And that is the most important distinction, because if you look at literature, especially within Africa, largely industrial policy has been interchangeably used together in manufacturing. And the author's definition is that that is not necessarily the case. And then the primary, then they make this distinction, which is also associated with price theory, the Chicago economics thinking, which is that industrial policies have actually been advocated on the basis that they can correct market failures when private incentives fail to produce growth. And when there is a market failure is when largely in economics, if you use Samuelsonian definition, is that the marginal costs are higher than the marginal benefits. And that necessitates government, that could be a ground where government could necessitate government intervention. And it could be, the intervention could come in many forms, whether it's the inadequacy of public goods or certain public services or certain private goods. So for example, skills, it could be in any other area. Then they make another distinction that market failures occur when those investment decisions need to be coordinated, like when information is scarce and businesses need to learn from each other by sharing inputs or training and training labor. So those are some of the things that we think that distinctively these reports make a very big difference in trying to lay the foundational in laying that foundational clarity. The second question is that they noticed that industrial policy is more replicable on three, but based conditional on three key issues. One, they define as government bandwidth. Government bandwidth is actually the capacity of, it's that capacity that government has to deliver services. The second question is the issue of local market size, that domestic demand is able to meet, if you take domestic demand and that preferential export market, they can determine whether protected farms can reach efficient scale. The third question is that ability to mobilize revenue without crowding out now to mobilize revenue to deploy for industrial policy without necessarily crowding out basic services that government is required to provide. So like education, health, or basic infrastructure spending. Then some of the things that they notice about is that advanced economies are able to deploy the full menu of all, and we are going to discuss that full menu of all industrial policies from wide-ranging things, from either production and whether it's innovation subsidies, local content, R&D, because of the strength in the three areas. But as you all know about the a low middle income LMIC like Kenya, the competitiveness in things like management of exchange rates and things such as industrial parks. Then one of the things that they also made the distinction is on the types of the types of industrial policy tools, because they ask themselves, what industrial policy tools have the greatest potential to grow business activities? Then they went ahead now and they came up with three broad categories, which is public inputs tailored to the needs of a specific industry or activity, and then market incentives that encourage a specific industry or activity, and then the macroeconomic interventions that broadly incentivize industrial policy goals. So they ask themselves, what are the most important policy tools for growth? And then they came with these three broad categories, of which those three broad categories, they listed a set of 15 policy tools, which we are going to discuss now. This is a snapshot from the report. They came up with, so remember, a industrial policy tool has to address market failure. And then when it addresses market failure, they're able to rank it by first choice or second choice. And then they also provided some set of examples that can address that market failure. So of those market failure. So for example, like a coordination failure. So they proposed, so an industrial policy tool is like industrial parks. And then the second question is skills development, market access, standards and quality, standards infrastructure, which is that ability to have standard agencies that can certify products, specific innovation subsidies, commodity export bans, public procurement, import tariffs and quotas, and then the export subsidies. Each of these are addressing specific problems. So where they think that there is a coordination failure, that, for example, that some costs are too high, and that would necessitate the creation of an industrial park, or some certain preferential regulation in a certain location, that would incentivize, that would lower those costs and then allow fast movers to coordinate and pull labor together. Then there is an industrial park. And then for skills, for example, and the investment in training, there are specific, what we call the specialty degree programs, what they also call the special, those apprenticeships linking higher education to linking higher education to specific sectors. Then so some the first six, which is industrial parks, skills development, market access assistance, quality in the quality infrastructure, and here it's the standards and metrology, and then production subsidies, and then special innovation subsidies, as ranked as the most primary, more primary industrial policy tools. The rest, the second choices is when the first choice fails, or the first choice is not able to address the second options. Now are things like commodity export bans. For the case of Kenya, it's the licensing and the quotas and other the licensing regime that restricts restricts specific commodities, public procurement. You all know about the affirmative action, and also the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya, manufacturing, the import tariffs and quotas. A good example would be the example in the sugar sector, where specific tariffs, so like previously, last year and going back, the sugar sector has been largely protected through tariffs, because the sugar from the other COMESA countries, Kenyan sugar would not be able to compete against those specific COMESA sugar. Then the export subsidies. The other things include technology, the transfer, technology transfer, quid pro quo, when foreign investors form joint ventures to transfer technology that is not available to license locally, local content requirements, and then consumer demand subsidies. Those are second choices. For the macro interventions, it's on two areas, the R&D tax credit, and then the competitive exchange rate devaluation. So those are 15 set of policy tools. They're very comprehensive. And for them to be able to come with these 15 policy tools, they looked at more than 100 national industrialization plans. So it's a very comprehensive set of tools that actually shows that global traction. Then one of the things they also needed, they quantified, is that in each policy tool, so if you look at the public inputs tailored to needs of a specific activity, the market incentives, and the macroeconomic interventions, there would be minimum country requirements for each of those. So for example, so like skills development, it will require a bigger government bandwidth. And that's why you see, for example, for the case of Kenya, we've seen TTIs are being built, the technical training institutes are being built across Kenya. It's that government bandwidth that is being extended. Look at things like quality infrastructure. It requires the standards infrastructure. It requires a large government bandwidth. Production subsidies require also large government bandwidth and also require large fiscal space. Things like public procurement, which is a second choice, require large bandwidth. It requires a local market size that is larger, and also requires a fiscal space that is large. If you look at technology quid pro quo. So there are specific demands that require each of these set of policy tools require, and you realize that majority of them require larger fiscal space and also a bigger government bandwidth. That level of efficiency of bigger government bandwidth. As a public policy institute, we've studied. So we're going to give an example of Government of Kenya. The Government of Kenya provide few services very well. And one of those services that they provide very well is something like education, especially at the at the primary level. They're able to, so it's largely some of these things will not be able, Kenya will not be able to meet some of these minimum requirements because of either the problems with fiscal space or the government bandwidth issues. Then another thing that we also looked at that is very unique that we want to highlight is that direct business subsidies by income groups. But if you take high income countries, upper middle income countries, low and lower middle income countries, you realize that first, the trajectory of business subsidies of all categories of incomes in all categories of countries' incomes have been on upward trajectory, except for COVID. Even though for low and lower middle income, even with COVID, those subsidies continue to go up higher. For upper middle income, it's similar for upper middle income, but for high income countries, subsidies went lower. And that is something that we see from that. The one thing that you also realize, the low and lower middle income countries between 2009 and 2012 actually were spending more on as a share of GDP on business subsidies than high income countries. That is a very that's something that to wonder. If you look at, and then they produced a chart for 2022, now considering direct funding, dividing the two subsidies into either direct funding or tax expenditures. But for the year 2022, then when you look at that chart, the low and lower middle income countries have a direct funding of 1.5% as a share of GDP, and then 1.1% as a share of GDP on tax expenditures. If you look at share composition, it mirrors similar structure for high income countries. And because high income countries, 60% of subsidies provided are direct funding to farms. So if you look, given the fact that the challenges of fiscal space that low and lower middle income countries have, there's significantly an higher trade-off because more farms are recipient of direct government help that the structure designed for low and low middle income countries reflects up high income countries, despite the fact that structurally, both on fiscal space terms, but also in terms of competitiveness, these firms in these two different categories are completely different. Kwame will discuss that in detail at the end. So what are some of the things that the reports get right? One of those things is that the report brings something new, which is that it assembles data from 60 plus countries, 183 national plans, but also it brings and then the global trade alert data showing discrimination measures by each of these countries. So we are moving away on industrial policy from just the Korean and the Japanese examples. So it's broadening debate. So this is something that we see as more valuable, and given the fact that that data is available for replication, this is diversifying debate. The second question is one of the most important things, and this now goes to the undercurrents of the media reporting. One of the things that the report shows is that even under ideal conditions, industrial policy delivers an average gain of something like 1% of GDP. While when people say that this report endorses that the World Bank has said there has to be a shift towards industrial policy, we don't see it, and it's there in the report. The third question is, so it's a useful correction to advocates who present industrial policy as a transformative growth strategy path. The third question is, the 25th most poorest economies impose the highest average tariffs of 12%. And then subsequently, heavy user countries in the upper and middle income economies lead on subsidies, something like 4.2% of GDP. And that is the most important observation. The report calls this what it is. Wrong tools are applied with wrong intensity in the wrong contexts. So when we hear people say that the World Bank, that report endorses a new path for industrial policy, they've given a demonstrable justification for why people should even be more cautious of industrial policy. Because if you look at all those contexts, and then the first choice, direct subsidies that fix a specific market failure are first choice. And as a think tank that supports free markets, we support government intervention only in those specific terms, especially when there is a market failure problem. So and then tariffs, local contents, FX devaluation are second choices because their costs spill across the economy. So that's that. So to us, those are the things that the report gets right. One of other thing that the report mentions directly is that the subsidies that attract lobby, and given the fact that arguments have been made in the past that also targeting should be done on basis of the jobs alone, is misleading, because incumbents in those declining industries lobby hardest for support. And in Kenya, we've been able to see this. So like the current government in Kenya had a very robust plan to deal with sugar even before they were elected. If you see the policy results that they've put in place, is actually a truncated result of what they promised, because the consequences, it's very difficult to outlive consequences, because those incumbents in those industries have big agency to make decisions. And then also what the report gets right is on sunset and exit, insisting on sunset clauses. Industrial policy must be temporary, and government should commit to fixing fundamentals within those 10 years. And that is something that we also agree. And then the most important thing that we also get from the report is industrial policy cannot substitute fundamentals, which is, so those macroeconomic stability, and low inflation remain non-negotiable preconditions. And they make an argument using the Asian miracle. And then investment in education, health, infrastructure must be actively or must be in place or actively being built before instruments are deployed. And then the third question is, open trade remains the discipline because that's the best competition policy that distinguishes effective industrial policy from disguised protection. Because even if local farms can compete, you will only know if the policy is working, if local farms can compete in global markets. So industrial policy cannot substitute fundamentals. So that is something that we read from the report. So we'll look at at what is reported in the media, and then we don't get it, why that view has been developed. So what the report doesn't get right? If you look at some of those cases that they've discussed, the more replicable claim, it leans on very small set of curated successes. So you look at some of those examples. So for example, they don't make this consideration of what would have happened if they don't consider the counterfactual, which is what governments would have produced even if left alone. What are some of those things? So that's the counterfactual, where if government had not intervened in those specific set of industries, what would have remained? What result would have been there? The second question is those institutional preconditions. So they make examples on Korea, Romania. So Romania was already an EU member and being an EU member came with certain set of requirements on markets, on rule of law. There are specific things that came about from being just an EU member. So if you make an observation, those small sets of curated successes, you have to consider the counterfactual or consider some of those institutional requirements. And then Korea and the Korea example and the case of General Park and the pursuit of policies. So for example, like whether the currency should be free floating, opening up markets, or opening Korean domestic market to global farms. So some of those things, if you consider them, it's clear that if you want replication, there's some specific things, whether institutional or whether institutional or political choices that have to be made. Another thing that the clear thing that we see from the report is the public choice economics is acknowledged but not internalized. So for example, it makes that argument that it's to expand the policy menu, which is first choice, use a larger part of first choice, but what we what we know from political economy is that, and from the literature done by Buchanan, Tulloch, and Han Kruger, is that countries with weaker institutions, if you make an assumption that governments will pick the right tool, time it correctly, and exit on schedule, even if you have that wide-ranging set of policy choices, largely governments with weaker institutions will not be able to succeed. And that's why if that prediction of, if you expand discretionary subsidy authority, it increases the quantum of rent seeking. We know this because there is another World Bank report, a diagnostic of Kenya's manufacturing, that was done in 2016, that distinguishes that there are a set of Kenyan farms that could compete in upper and middle income economies, meaning that they can compete globally. But there are a set of many other Kenyan farms, what they call the laggards, who actually cannot survive without government policy. So it's public choice economics would be important if designing those policy portfolios without considering public choice would be largely impossible and unworkable. That opportunity cost, if you average benefit is 1% of GDP, but the average spending in an heavy user country is 4% of GDP, to implement either of those 15 policy sets of choices, there is an opportunity cost, and that is something that has an implication for jobs, because once you've spent that money, whether in the fiscal space or expanding government bandwidth, or expanding government bandwidth, it's very there's a regressive incidence of those subsidies, and that regressive incidence has an implication. So, for example, to give the context of Kenya, the biggest recurrent transfer outside education is transfers to state corporations. So there is an implication when you do such kind of policy, or even if that policy is going to go in, that industrial policy is going to go into something else. So every shilling spent on a tax holiday for a target farm is a shilling that is not spent on basic education, primary health care. So if you spend 4% to an additional 1%, that, if you calibrate that, so you are losing for every 1 shilling you put up, for every 4 shillings you put on the table, you're losing 3 to gain an additional 1. So that is something that the trade-off is something to consider. So they provide what the World Bank, that report recognizes, makes a broad recognition of the political economy risks. And then they adopt something they call the portfolio approach, which is now to engage entrepreneurs, identify constraints, tailor interventions, track progress, and withdraw if productivity gains are not observed within a reasonable amount of time. That would work. In an ideal environment, that would work. The problems, there are two sets of problems. One, the sunset clauses, the experimentation. So the experimentation, the report not those sunset clauses can be defeated by political pressure. However, then they recommend experimentation, which is a softer commitment device than sunset. But so then the second issue is that part of that reasonable time is undefined. If you take, for example, 10 to 20 years, for that to manifest, because we know from the case of Kenya, industry and to see policy change, to see benefits from policy change, you have to take an horizon between 6 to 8 years. But if you take a longer period from that, by that time, the constituency that benefits from the subsidy has captured the agency that was meant to evaluate it. So experimentation risks now being an open-ended subsidy, and it's a modern name for permanence. And long before this, there's an economist called Milton Friedman who actually observed that temporary government programs, there's nothing called temporary government program unless you are specifically curtailing it by law. In the end, those temporary government programs end up being permanent. Thank you so much. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Thanks, Leo. So we'll go through this the rest of the session very quickly, but let me try and just recap by saying we've learned three things. One, that the authors say that they've given a fair shake, in my view, and given what Leo said, they look like they did not decide beforehand that we're going to agree or disagree with the industrial policy. Given a definition, distinguishing industrial policy from manufacturing policy, which in Kenya tends to be used interchangeably, as if one was necessarily the other. That's not true. So at least for that, they've created that awareness. And then say that industrial policy works best where there are three ideal conditions. One is that government had bandwidth, which is basically the ability of government to design and execute the policy properly, right? Which is interesting because in Kenya, many people say things such as, well, a policy was designed, but implementation is a problem. Now, if you have a problem in implementing a policy, then why design it in the first place? So that's one check. I think it needs to. The second is a government must have fiscal space, beg your pardon, because you might have to spend and put money behind the policy choices that have been made. Remember, it's government favoring or making the choice that this industry is required to grow, to scale, what they like as well. So you must have the fiscal space to be able to back it up, back up that policy choice. So the third is at market size. If you have domestic market size that allows for that experimentation to take place, if those three align, then industrial policy becomes a choice that the government can consider seriously. I think also because if you have a market size and fiscal space and government capacity of benchmarks, then any industrial policy mistakes are not going to be very expensive. I think that's one thing that it tells us. Then it goes now to the chapters. It's 7 chapters, but I'll just highlight 5, 6, and 7. In chapter 5, basically, it's talk about getting institutions right, because it's really, really essential to get institutions right. And chapter 5 is getting institution right. Chapter 6 is about applications with narrow objectives, where industrial policy is not necessarily all about driving growth per se, but where government chooses and says, look, for instance, we want a Konza city, we want a city to develop a specific industry just based on choice, and not necessarily the idea is not necessarily to drive growth rates, but the idea is to drive a specific sectoral outcome. And then in the chapter 7 is a policy brief, which I think if 200 pages is too much for you, you can, like I did, start by reading chapter 7, which is a policy brief, fairly concise, meant for policy scholars, but also one which is advice for governments. But let me now come on the basis of this very comprehensive survey of industrial policy choices, looked at some case studies. What are the lessons that we draw? Again, this is our reading. What are the lessons that we draw for Kenya? And some will be very obvious, some of them not. We have noted that the design of incentives for low and middle income countries have same fiscal effect as high income countries. So if Kenya's approach is typical, and what this means is that, as you saw in one of the charts that Leo placed before us, the three forms. Basically, governments balance industrial policy if you're putting skin in the game by either tax expenditures or by direct fiscal expenditure. And many countries in middle income, which is S here, as you can tell, is the upper middle income, tends to favor tax expenditures as opposed to direct funding. Tax expenditures on the other side, which is foregone tax as opposed to collecting the revenue first and then spending that money on industrial policy. And if you look at high income and low and middle income, where Kenya would fall, it's the same pattern now. Scope might be, but it's the same pattern in terms of the proportion that is spent, which means these are countries that spend more on the fiscal direct funding, which means government collects revenues and then uses it to fund or to subsidize one sector, as opposed to just the taxes foregone. And Leo and I are asking ourselves that we don't think the authors told us what the consequence of this means, but Leo and I are asking ourselves that, it looks like low-income countries, especially if we consider that they need high bandwidth, they need the fiscal space, and they need high market sizes, are taking the approach by high-income countries which a wrong fiscal policy is something that they can actually absorb the consequences of. So it looks to us as if low and middle-income countries have to consider about how to rejig these configurations, something about using more money in direct funding, which means basically funding the farms or specific sectors is quite peculiar in our view. And it might reflect the political economy considerations. Why? Because the people who are up there are actually people who want to see direct government money going to specific farms that are chosen. Remember, this is government choosing one farm. So that we find as a very, very interesting one, and something for which farms are gained directly from government spending. Now, the other one is that the three preconditions which I've mentioned should be considered before a redesign, say, of Vision 2030. So Kenya's Vision 2030 was drawn very competently, and many people lament that, well, the only reason Kenya isn't where it was is because, well, the politics or people did not, it was designed but not implemented as intended. Maybe that's so. But we have to ask ourselves if the preconditions that this report have stated, and I think that is novel compared to what other assessments of the industrial policy and its effectiveness have been, shows that, look, did government of Kenya have fiscal space? I'm not too sure it did, because the government of Kenya went into huge borrowing, which has over time then undermined the ability to actually sustain those investments that are required. Market size, Kenya doesn't have, and obviously government bandwidth is something that the report itself says is growing in all parts of the, even in smaller countries, but government of Kenya did not have. So if you look at that Vision 2030, for all the fact that there's a delivery unit and all those other things that are required for institutional preconditions, the preconditions were not all checked. In fact, as a matter of fact, Kenya just had a decent level on the first one, which is basically government bandwidth, by virtue of the fact that you're establishing a separate fund. Fiscal space did not exist and market size did not exist. And for that reason, the scale of the Vision 2030 perhaps was prematurely placed here, and we're not surprised that it has fast failed, or rather, I don't know whether it's disappointed, but it's very, very clear that it has not attained what was required. We are 4 years away from, 3.5 years away from its conclusion, and it's very, very clear that unless there's significant magic, I mean, where Kenya would grow at 15% or so, it is unlikely that the requirements in terms of income, manufacturing sector's share of the economy, and obviously the balance and employment outcomes will be achieved. And then when we tried on a very basic basis, on the basis of the 15 policy tools that have been identified by the study, which they've rigorously classified, and we think that's also one thing that really provides some illumination to the design of industrial policy, we saw that most of Kenya's policy tools are the second choice, because what the authors say is fine. Governments will make a choice about what sectors to support or what sectors to privilege over others, but it is best to go for first policy choices as opposed to the second policy choice. So basically saying that if you must go for it, consider the priority areas. And the first policy choices are actually 6 of the 15, which in that portfolio. Most of Kenya's are actually in the second choice, which is spending money here. There are subsidies to sectors, whether on the consumption side or subsidies to inputs. I mean, subsidies. So, and you can see some of them restriction on exports, as you can see, macadamia, avocado, and leather exports, with the view that refusing to, I mean, banning exports or restricting exports will lead to domestic manufacturing or domestic sectoral expansion. The study is telling us that these are second choice policy choices. They're also very, very expensive. And in Kenya's case, even then, we do not see evidence that they've led to that. So again, while I am sure, one of the things that I read when I saw this is that when Kenya's people see the outline of this report in general by saying, look, we cannot discount outright industrial policy. I'm sure that Kenya's bureaucrats are licking their lips, hoping that they can come at us as taxpayers to fund a whole lot of very crazy ideas, good, bad, and very ugly ideas. But I can tell you they'll probably be falling on the bad and ugly ones. I think there's also an overemphasis on industrial parks. And here we're not too sure we agree with this report. Because so let's face this, but the Copenhagen Consensus, of course, which is I think based in Denmark, and we know it, has carried out some of the very concrete cost effectiveness analysis of industrial parks and special economic zones and all that stuff. And the result they give is that they are not the best uses of public money for a country of any size interested in simply driving GDP growth. So the idea that actually industrial parks come up here is one that's very, very interesting. But more importantly, because in a place like Kenya, we've had industrial parks at all scales, at the county levels, everybody's trying to establish an industrial park. And they use any justification for what they call an industrial park. Free water, free services, free land and all that. And we're not seeing that those have been determined. Have determined proper outcomes. So we are guessing whether it's just poor design, which will always be a problem for industrial policy, because everybody will choose what they want beforehand and try to use an industrial policy argument to support its implementation. Now, going to the second slide. Yes, I think it also reminds us that the government of Kenya should concentrate policy on provision of public goods. For a country at the low middle income level, we think that an industrial policy stretch into industrial policy, or a sprint towards industrial policy tools, in my view, will be a bridge too far, and it's past premature and it's too early. Because any policy mistakes that government makes, however good, well-intended, the faith is in industrial policy choices and it's probably going to come short. And there's no doubt that there's certainty in any industrial policy choice that's chosen. So our view is that for GOK, I think we should concentrate on policy provision of the basic public goods. We know what most of them are. We saw, and Leo has mentioned this, as a trade-off analysis says that even when industrial policy has been delivered based on capacity, fiscal space being available, government capacity, fiscal space being available, and the market size being available, the average expenditure for industrial policy is about 4% of GDP annually. And all that generates an additional 1 percentage point of GDP up. And we're not too sure that that's a good that's a good trade-off, especially if you think about it coolly in terms of, yes, government has a choice to spend this money here or to spend it in other ways. So if you're going to spend 4% of GDP for a return of 1% of GDP, I'm not too sure that's a good return. Actually, what it's showing is that basically that needs to be reconsidered, or it actually requires a little bit more scrutiny of what the industrial policy choices will be. The report mentioned, and I think this is one area that countries should make a very big leap, and that is the problem in industrial policy. Again, Kenya's case is how Kenya decided that, look, good coffee producer, some basic industrial tools goods are exported from Kenya, but how Kenya decided to make the leap from targeting, from efficiency or a domestically working telecommunications sector, and then to decide overall that we can make microchips or IC, integrated chips. In my view, sometimes, and that looks like a very big one. But if you look at the targeting, this product-based approach, Postman's product-based approach, which is to actually ask if you're going to support industrial policy or if you're going to execute an industrial policy or pursue, then perhaps it's best to look at, okay, what is it that's being done already? What are Kenyan farms doing successfully? And then how do we push them towards a new product space that is related so that they can use already the accumulated knowledge that is available to jump to a different area? But a very big leap. Why? Because everybody today is making, say, microchips, or it's a fun industry, is likely to actually lead to other unpleasant outcomes, in addition to, of course, not just the failure of that policy, but you're going to be sunken for a very, very long time. And then finally, there's the requirement for sunset clauses and acceptance of sunk costs. That's difficult because that's really like a political decision. One thing that this report emphasizes, and I think which we need to understand as Kenyans and which we would like to, which makes us still very circumspect about saying that industry policy is a choice for developing for a country like Kenya, is, look, Kenya's sugar industry, at one point, the sugar industry was Kenya's largest industrial crop. For that reason, it was kept on the banners for a very long time, government subsidies protecting it through tariffs, but while providing subsidies, on the other hand, government taking over the debts of the sugar industry, right? A generation and a half and more, and going into COMESA and leaving after 25 years tells us that, well, this was extended quite a lot. So the infant industry argument did not work here, but it's because government of Kenya never has sunset clauses for any industry. So I think it's difficult here to have a device commitment for time, which then helps to discipline the industry that's benefiting from subsidies or any kind of protection or any kind of government support, which is basically denied to others. But what this paper reminds us of now is that countries that actually, or anytime a choice is being made, I think it's very, very clear to communicate to private enterprises or public enterprises that there's a sunset clause, whether for funding or whether for that policy. Why? Because an acceptance of the sunk cost is essential. But the fear is that when you start to support an industry, it tends to lock in, as Leo mentioned, Milton Friedman. There's no more permanent industry as one that is started with the intention that it should be temporary. It just ticks. You develop new lobbies who have an interest in keeping that industry going and to give government support, right up there. So that's also the goods, the bads, the uglies of industry policy. Thank you very much. So now we're going to open up this conversation to, that's a reference to the book, and we have a link to it, a URL link in the chat box, and you can take that. Now, so we have now the opportunity to ask our questions, so to show any, to receive your comments on this conversation. If you've had a look at it, please, so we can have questions or any comments that you might have, other thing that you'd like for us to clarify. As we said, we'll have this into two phases. The first part is basically we at the IEA giving our own views about what our reading of the report is. And if possible, in a subsequent conversation, we could ask somebody from the IMF, an author or one person who can actually go into what the content of the report is and highlight what their own views are and have an exchange with us as well. So we are promising to host that conversation soon after this. Now, what do? Please raise your hand, as the toolbar right floating at the top of your screen allows you with a series of menus. So please, you can raise your hand or perhaps punch a question, ask a question through the chat box, and I'll ask that question and ensure that Leo answers them. So let me hear from somebody. Okay, so first here is Mushai. Yes, Mushai, would you like to ask a question? So please switch on your microphone and your camera. And
camera can't go on, but I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, the camera has been enabled. But anyway, thanks a lot for that presentation. Interesting as always to hear from you guys. I think my question is whether they added the element of time and consistency, because I think one of our complaints in Kenya, especially industrial policy, is the zigzagging. I like the fact that you mentioned like Vision 2030, although maybe it was our possibly longest lasting. I had at some time on that Vision 2030 board, and we were basically crippled and we were basically outside of government and not really effective at that point. So the consistency of application of policy, I think, is one of the big challenges. And I don't know if it's mentioned at all in the report.
All right, thanks, Mishai. Should I have another question? Then we can have Leo. Okay, Phyllis. Yes, go ahead, Phyllis.
Thank you so much for going through the report. I joined late. I got caught up in another meeting, but I would love to see the presentations. But interesting to see the direction the World Bank is taking on industrial policy, which I think is long overdue and timely, considering the geopolitics and the direction we've been seeing being taken globally, because industrial policy is being utilized very heavily, as you probably saw in the report or have said in the developed countries. And my challenge is that we could be driving the gap even wider if we are not then being strategic about how we move forward, even with the findings and everything from this report. So the question I had, I don't know if from the report World Bank has come out clearly on industrial policy country level tools that would be something that starts being put in place to ensure that industrial policy is implemented. And from your reading of the report, from an FCFTA angle, where do you see the opportunity? Because at the end of the day, industrial policy a lot of times is designed at country level, because a lot of the incentives or different things you'd need to put in place, whether it's the industrial parks and things like that, would happen at country level. But from a regional perspective, how do you see it playing out? But yes, I think a follow-up conversation would be good. The report is quite detailed. It would be nice to see how we unpack it even further. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Phyllis. Thank you. So that's 2 questions. Any other question before we go back to trying to answer them? Okay. Looks like let me just check the chat if there's a typing question. No, there isn't. Let me find that. Okay, there seems to be no typing question. So Leo, please, Mushai asked about basically the added element of time and consistency, and what did the authors say about that? And then Phyllis has asked about industrial policy country level tools and what are the implications for after.
Yes. So to answer Mushai's question, so they have addressed the question of time. In the what they call the portfolio, once you've taken up a portfolio or set of tools, of industrial policy tools, they are proposing that it becomes now you evaluate you evaluate if productivity gains are being achieved or not. But there is a sense that it's between 10 to 20 years. So similar, similar. But as a policy solution, they've put it as an open-ended, so that once those productivity gains are not being observed, you are able to withdraw. It doesn't matter whether so it has something, an automatic sunset clause, which is if there are no productivity gains, you withdraw, even if it's in the 4th or 5th or 7th year, as a policy solution. Because the caveat for them is if there are no gains, that policy shouldn't continue, because it shouldn't continue. On the question from Phyllis, so they identified 15 policy areas. I know you said that you came in late. They identified a set of 15 policy tools over 3 broad areas. The ones that provide public inputs, market incentives, the ones that give market incentives, and then macroeconomic interventions. So then they rank them. The first 6, there are 6 policy tools that are considered as first choice, and then the others that are considered as second choice. So those ones so they identified them. They identified them and they proposed which should be considered first choice, and they give the caveat that those first choice instruments should be able to directly address specific market failure. So like they provided, the 6 are: 1, industrial parks. The second one is in skills development. The third one is market access, innovation subsidies, innovation subsidies. So those are the ones that directly address they directly address the issue now of market failure, so that they're correcting for that market failure. So the others are second choices are public procurement, R&D on tax tax credit or R&D, exchange rate devaluation, and many others. So they identified those the set of 15 policy tools, but the cost and benefit of each is very clear from the report. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, fine. So yes, so Phyllis, we're going to share the slides. Thank you very much. Let me see if there's another question. Okay, no, but let me add something, Phyllis. Yes, there's a framework that's been presented. I had to copy it basically. It's called the Benefits Feasibility Framework. And what it allows is, or rather, they suggest in Chapter 7 is that it matches the tools to country capacity, because they're saying that a predictor of whether industrial policy will be successful is a country capacity, fiscal space, and obviously market size. So because judgment needs to be made, they provide a framework that allows a country, when it's making that choice, for instance, to consider like some matrix about whether that country capacity exists and to match the tools to the country capacity. And as Leah said, they identified 15 different industrial policy tools, starting from obviously, and they say that the best one is actually industrial parks. Other people question whether industrial parks do exist, but they're saying that industrial parks help with actually the coordination problem, with bringing all government coordinating business activity in one area. It's the cluster argument and that. So each of them is, and out of that then of course comes out of that then comes the ranking, which is first choice and second choice. And they say second choice is unlikely to deliver good outcomes, but they're actually also very expensive because it's forcing governments to actually have to spend. And in our typing, basically based on how they describe it, we found out that most of the industrial policy tools identified in Kenya, or those that we could identify, tend to be second choice. No wonder they're not giving us, no wonder they're not getting the right outcome, or at least sustaining it. For Mushai, yes. They acknowledge the political economy problem that comes with lobbies, that once you've established an industrial policy, whether under infant industry or for any other reason to go into a new area, among the things that then happens is you generate incentives for an industry to keep those incentives on through lobbying, whether they've worked or not. If they've worked, they'll give the impression that withdrawing those incentives would actually disadvantage that industry. If they're not working, everybody says that, look, it's still an industrial, it's still an infant industry, and so let's maintain it. So there's a big political choice. And so they say the way to do that is actually to do it ex ante, which is to say, we are going to maintain this policy only for 10 years, and then apply a stringent rule of assessing whether productivity is happening on a grid or not. But I think what they say is that the guts to actually cut off an industrial policy measure is mostly political, because sometimes what happens is one administration starts it, and then it's the other administration that subsequently has to give the bad news. And of course, they know what the political fallout from that might be. So that's why it's a difficult choice altogether. After the development of global value chains, or regional value chains, I didn't examine it clearly, but I don't think they give it much thought. But you're right, Phyllis, when we have Tristan Reed, who's a friend of the IE as well, and he's here, we'll alert you so that we can actually pose this question again to him. We'll send the presentation to everybody right at the end of this meeting. We are close to our time, but I'll open up for another round of questions. Are there any other questions? Does anyone want to make a comment or highlight something that for someone who's read it, and something that we did not sufficiently cover? Anyone else? Oh yes, there's something in the box. Okay, so Phyllis has asked a question again. This is to you, Leo. What safeguards does the report recommend to ensure industry policy avoids capture and inefficiency while still being bold enough to drive structural transformation? Phyllis, that's a really difficult one. But Leo, go ahead. Did you discuss safeguards?
Yes. So Phyllis, one of the things that we get that the report doesn't speak more to, and this is the nature of World Bank reports, they are very diplomatic, is the question about they observe that incumbents in those specific industries that are considered as dying or uncompetitive lobby the hardest, and they have they're able to lobby the hardest. One of the problems with this report is the problem of the public choice, which is the political economy problems. They've tried to walk away from internalizing those costs of political economy. So they don't bring those safeguards. They only mention the question of time. Say, for example, that there should be automatic sunsets, and those sunsets should come from if those productivity gains are not approached. They've gone to softer commitment devices like, for example, experimentation, allow more. So it's not specifically very strong on those safeguards, and those safeguards come from political economy. Similar to what they observe on the country context, one thing that they observe is that each industrial policy needs the benefit framework needs to be fitted to country context. But the challenge is there are specific political economy contexts that are related directly to those country contexts, and it comes more from political choices rather than economic. So that's a challenge. So it's very weak on those on the capture and inefficiency. But the design is that they take cognizance that those challenges exist and are very real. Thank you.
All right.
Kwame.
Leo, there's another
Thanks for
question
that.
from Emmanuel.
That the scholars, at least those outside the report, have bold ideas how to avoid capture.
Wait,
and
just
even
a minute. Let me ask
Okay.
Emmanuel to just ask his question. Emmanuel, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, thanks. So my question is, do you think that the scholars, at least outside these reports, have bold ideas about how to avoid capture and even to reverse capture where exists? So as an aside, I saw that even during the recent presentations on industrial policy hosted by the World Bank, the scholars present had nothing to say. They either ignored the question entirely when posed or claimed that they were not local enough to answer, implying that it would be colonial to even dare to make prescriptions, or they just had nothing to add in that direction. Thanks.
Okay, Leo, go ahead. Yes. So the question about capture is first, there's a political economy issue around the way World Bank reports are produced. That's the nature of they don't make those direct those direct prescriptions. But one thing that the report for us, and I think the most important thing, and that's Kwame will emphasize this as we close, is the report makes it very direct that the cost benefit for an industrial policy largely, because if you spend 4% of GDP to gain 1% in benefit, there's an opportunity cost. So those, I think, are domestic policy questions that now from that data, and that's why they provided the replication package for the data that they used in the day, is for us to be able to make those arguments. Because it's for like, for example, if you are in the sugar belt, the maize belt, the cereals belt, the cereals belt, maize, rice, and other things, that alone in Kenya forms a very big chunk of the voting population. If you had coffee and tea, that's basically a substantial part of voting population. So they have serious political economy convening when it comes to industrial policy. And they predetermine, and some of those predeterminations, that predetermination is not consistent to the ambition of economic growth. They're inconsistent. Those are always inconsistent. So if you take such kind of a framing, it's not that capture is going to happen. Then there are other discrete partners. So for example, those ones who make specific, say for example that clinker should not be imported, and many others. So those things are solutions that the law either has been banned or there is real political convening power, or those specific players are able to actually play around with treasury and parliament to be able to achieve those goals. So it's a mix, and match. But for them, they've made policy prescription such that it's up to you to interpret what it means for your local context. But they are very clear that, and even they made example that incumbents in those dying industries lobby the hardest to be able to get. So they are aware, but whether what needs to be done to them is something they've left it open-ended, which, because it's domestic policy question, it's up to us to decide, and up to if you're an American, if you're British, if you're Kenyan like us or South African, it's up to you to decide what the domestic policy question should be and how that should be treated. And I don't think they are very circumspect, but they are very also weak in that area of public choice. Thank you. Back to you, Pam.
All right. Okay. We don't have other questions, but we need to close. Okay. Thanks. I think the only thing I can add before I ask Leo to make the final comments is I'll lead you all to chapter 5, because most of those who've asked questions, especially Mushai and Emmanuel and Phyllis, chapter 5. And I'll just one of the things that is chapter 5 is about getting the institutions right. It's very, very clear that industrial policy has been tried. It has mixed results, and everybody, as Leo said, analyzed or overemphasized the successes of Ministry of Industry, Trade and Industry, Industrialization, Trade and Industry in Japan, and obviously South Korea, and to an extent Taiwan. But these are tools that have been tried in a whole variety of contexts, and therefore assessing the entire base of them was what was essential. The finding that institutional capability or getting the institutions right is one of the big things, and it emphasizes what has been held elsewhere. They identify some 5 things that would make people in the public sector just lick their lips, because it's as if they're endorsing it, but not exactly in my view, but just saying that if you must go for industrial policy, these things you need to get right. 1, you need the concept of national development banks. You might need state-owned enterprises, cluster initiatives. Number 3, public-private dialogue, something that we also like in Kenya, and that's useful outcomes. Innovation agencies, investment promotion services, and export promotion services. And when Leo and I came to discussing about this, we say, all these we have. So why aren't we getting the institutional character right? Because we have national development banks of some kind. We have state-owned enterprises, a whole motley of them. We have cluster initiatives through the special economic zones and the industrial parks. We have private-public dialogues, innovation agencies, investment promotion agencies, and export promotion agencies, of one kind or the other. So the individual performance of all these things is perhaps what hamstrings this. But as I conclude, I'll ask Leo to let's just tell me right now, given Kenya's constraints and what exists right now, right? What do you think is the biggest lesson people from the Treasury, specifically, and the Ministry of Industry should actually take from this report? You, as you make your final comments.
Yes. So the biggest lesson from is that if industrial policy does not lead to productivity gains, where that policy should not be and second. So the first thing is the measurement. So most policies have been in the books for as long as we've known the National Treasury, but without necessarily being measured what works and what does not work. And for those ones that are related directly, for example, to taxes or tax policy changes, have been changing. They've changed so rapidly that it's difficult to measure whether those specific tax policy changes led to those benefits or not. Another thing that Treasury should be able to learn is the question about most policies are second choice, and those second choice policies and even local content requirements, among other things, would not necessarily lead to have not been able to give Kenya that productivity advantage. So if you look at all these other things that Treasury has always supported, they don't necessarily work. So in the lastly, on that measurement question, that industrial policy, especially those that are linked to innovation subsidies or are linked to productivity subsidies, would performance-linked subsidies would work. And National Treasury should also make policy in a way that does not respond to those political economy power play that comes either for a wide variety of reasons. And then the biggest issue, lastly, as I conclude, industrial policy does not necessarily mean manufacturing. Industrial policy is strategic business activity, like the policy that leads to improvement in strategic business activity. So that use of manufacturing or in industrialization interchangeably with industrial policy is something that government needs to relook, and especially in its in the books, the way it's written, so that, because they recognize that efficiencies in one sector or performance of tax or production of products in the end will lead will improve would improve industrialization. So thank you so much, and looking forward to future. We'll be able to continue giving these Industry 254 conversations on a monthly basis, and be able to improve and build a reference group for Kenya's leading thinkers on industrialization and industrial policy. Thank you so much. Back to you, Kwame.
Right. Thanks a lot. Well, what do I take away? I take away from this that I think I have now a heuristic about how to assess industrial policy. So the first thing I'm going to ask myself is, do those three preconditions exist? Which one is this? The governance behavior or capability of government, the fiscal space, which obviously is essential. I don't know whether at this moment in 2026, April or May, we could say that space exists, and whether the market size. And if you know that Kenya is a small open economy, fiscal policy or fiscal industrial policy would have to check all these all together. And then after that, what is the fiscal policy tools of the 15? Which one is it? And where does it fall? If we decide we're not exporting gold, if you decide that leather should not be exported or macadamia should not be exported for domestic policy reasons, for industrial policy reasons, we need to actually ask ourselves whether in the litany of examples that this World Bank report has suggested, is that usually a good avenue? Is it a first choice or is it a second choice? Because that's useful. If the degree of success, the probability of success rises with the efficiency of the tool and the effectiveness of the tool that is chosen. So that's one other thing that I've taken up. And then, of course, we've seen that industrial policy has always been here. We are able to tell that, yes, it's not always just about industrialization, but if structural transformation is one of the things that's desired, some of the things that we might be as objectives for industrial policy would be this. One thing that I keep debating with myself about why I still remain an agnostic about industrial policy is that if government decides, for instance, that 15% of taxes on imports is what allows that industry to go ahead, to be competitive. I wonder why then it should not be that 15% is what should apply to everybody. so that the entire economy benefits from low taxation, including the favored industry, so that it does its best. So that's one of the things that I keep asking myself about how industrial policy is. And I think industrial policy, given the other things, the fundamentals that government has to do in macroeconomic stability and all those other things, is not an end in itself, because it must have complementary tools to ensure that it works. But it's back on the agenda. We're going to hear many more countries around. And last week, if you all remember, there was a conversation in Kenya covering one of Africa's richest people, Uganda government and Kenyan government, and obviously connecting Kenyans and Uganda to try and do some industrial policy based on the success of one country, one person. And I'm not too sure that's how industrial policy should be built, though of course many people were enamored by that. I mean, when you have a successful businessman holding fort and pontificating on how industrial policy and telling people that I'd be able to build this or that for you. And I'm just asking whether one example in Nigeria, successful as everybody claims it is, I wish it was one of those analyzed by this report, but it isn't, because it came before, is the real way to form industrial policy. I'm still asking myself that. I mean, I'm still cautious that one of the things that this report has told us, regardless of where you stand on the industrial policy support area, that it needs very careful review and circumspection. And I hope that's what we get from this. So thanks a lot, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here. We had a small mishap, but we came back on time to start this about 15 minutes late. But thanks for being here. We're glad that you support the work that the Institute of Economic Affairs does. We have many members here, but if you have considering renewing your membership for this year, we'd be glad to have you as a member of the Institute of Economic Affairs, holding these conversations and many others, and doing publications, or writing publications and circulating publications that helps you to be not just more fluent policy commentary, but also elevates your literacy around the area, but also provide an opportunity for you to meet other professionals in your sector and this. So thank you very much. We are going to send this presentation immediately after this. It will be available on our website. And for those who have their email addresses here, a link will be sent within the next hour so that you can interact with us. If you have any other subjects that you'd like for the IEA to cover, please send an email to us and we'll definitely provide that opportunity. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.